All right, so Marty, does it ever occur to you that on the strength side of things like how much you bench, hypertrophy, muscle up, that's way cooler than saying how much you VO2 max, because that's sort of this doesn't roll off the tongue. So what do you think?
I think welcome to the Exercise Science Podcast.
The Exercise Science Podcast, trained to improve your health and fitness.
Boom, there it is. I'm Martin Gibala. I'm here with Stuart Phillips. The Exercise Science Podcast is made to translate exercise science for the rest of the world.
Martin Gibala is the world's expert on high-intensity interval training and time-efficient cardio.
And Stuart Phillips is the global expert on strength development and protein.
Hard facts, no hype.
Remember, we're on most platforms at Real Exercise Science. Give us a follow or a subscribe.
So in this episode, we're going to talk about VO2 max, how to measure it, how to improve it, and why it's considered the fifth vital sign.
But first, a word from our sponsors.
Health information online is messy. Even the good stuff goes stale as science evolves. Consensus shifts, and what was solid 2 years ago may already be revised.
So what Everme built, a system that reads through filtered, vetted, published research papers and scores them for credibility before anything reaches you. They've actually filed patents for this technology.
On the app, you share your health goals, and you can also sync your wearables so it knows what your body is saying and what you're curious about. Every morning, you get a personalized health snapshot with an actionable intelligence. You can then link to the AI that learns and evolves with you, or learn more about longevity through dynamic podcasts or curated topics broken down into consumable formats.
Everme combines evidence-based research, advanced AI technology, and thoughtful design to support better everyday decisions related to long-term health and well-being. Learn more at everme.ai.
So let's try and, we got a range of people listening, obviously. We breathe in air, we extract oxygen. So let's unpack it for everybody and give us, and I know like it's what we do, right? Put stuff on the board. So let's kind of show people what VO2 max is and trying to explain it. And that gears analogy I really like. So let's take a look at that.
Sure. So, to be clear, what's VO2 max? It's the maximal amount of oxygen that can be taken up and utilized by the body. Now, it reflects a lot of complex underlying physiology, but that was beautifully summarized in this figure from a 1967 paper from
1967. They were doing good science back then.
Absolutely, yeah. But it really conveys this idea of gears churning. So you can imagine, your lungs, your heart, your blood vessels, your muscles, they all have to work together in order to bring oxygen into the body from the air and deliver it down to the working muscles to ride a bike or produce movement.
Yeah.
And so that really gets it across nicely, I think. You can make this figure really complex, but basically that's the idea of the gears analogy. And then what it's reflecting is essentially the ability of the body to deliver oxygen. And so that's, we call that systemic oxygen delivery. That's largely a function of the pumping capacity of the heart and the ability of the blood vessels to carry oxygen. Yeah. So it's really the product of your heart working and the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood. That's things like hemoglobin molecules, how much of that have, how much they're saturated. So that's sort of the delivery side.
Right.
And then the extraction is, you can imagine, mainly working muscles, but across all tissues of the body, what's the ability to take that oxygen out of the arterial blood, literally use it in the mitochondria to burn sugars and fats and produce energy. And then a small amount of that oxygen flows back up to the body. So we're really looking at that difference there, this idea of delivery minus extraction at a maximal level. That's VO2 max.
Yeah, so you're probably going to give, and I've heard from a few of our ex-students on Instagram already about how excited they are, and they're getting a flashback right now, and they're like, so I mean, there's lots to unpack here. We've got hemoglobin in our blood. So if you've got more of that, and I guess we can kind of squeeze a bit more out by, athletes train at altitude as a way to, or they blood dope, which is the other way.
Yep.
you got to have a big heart.
Yeah.
You got to have great lungs that really can oxygenate blood, but you also have to have some good extraction of oxygen down the level of the muscle and the capillaries as you've got on the picture here. So yeah, it's the integrated function of a lot of things, right? It's not just, you got a good heart and everything else like that.
Agree. And that's why I think such a simple measure, we really just measure oxygen uptake in the mouth, or we can estimate this reasonably. It's such a good proxy measure of all of these underlying physiological systems, which is probably why it's arguably our best measure of overall health and mortality risk, longevity, because it reflects all of this comprehensive physiology.
Yeah, and you threw the M word in there, the mitochondria, right? And I think, popular textbooks and, our good friend and colleague, Mark Tarnopolsky, would argue the most important part of any cell is the mitochondria. And that's got to work, right? It's got to be working really efficiently inside a muscle. So a lot of stuff going on.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, if there's a chink in the armor or if there's a stick in the gears anywhere, that can impact oxygen delivery. Yeah. So any of these processes, people say, well, what's the most important variable? As you know, I think the most important variable generally, so for healthy adults at sea level, it's the size of your heart, right?
Yeah.
Getting back to our discussion around, if you want to be an elite endurance athlete, you better be born with a genetic capacity to have a big heart. But, if you're someone with a spinal cord injury or a metabolic disease in your muscles, that markedly affects your mitochondrial capacity. And so clearly then there are other limits. Again, any chink in the armor or any point in the gears, if they're impaired, that's going to affect our VO₂max.
So when we talk about training, which of these is improving, or are they all improving?
Yeah, they're all improving. And so clearly, again, if we put 100 people on a training program and we measure who has the greatest increase in their VO₂max, that's pretty much going to correlate with, well, who has the biggest improvement in heart pumping capacity?
Okay.
And so it goes back to that idea of the heart's probably the main variable, but if your lungs don't respond, if you don't have an improvement in your maximal ventilation rate, or you don't have an improvement in capillary number or mitochondrial content, you're not going to improve as much. So clearly all of these things tend to change together, or they all go up to improve your capacity. But again, bringing it back, the heart's probably the number one thing, and the blood oxygen carrying capacity. We literally, as you know, we get more blood volume pretty quickly early in an exercise program, and that increase in blood volume is what in part helps the greater pumping capacity of the heart. You just have more blood in the system to move around and circulate around. We made the point about cardiorespiratory fitness is just the clinical correlate of VO₂max. So what that means is they're synonymous terms, right? In a health context, we talk about cardiorespiratory fitness. That's often, measured in these epidemiological studies, but the best measure of cardiorespiratory fitness is VO₂max.
Sure.
So they're essentially synonymous terms. And this is 10 years ago now. The American Heart Association came out with this commentary calling for cardiorespiratory fitness, VO₂max, to be a clinical vital sign, something that we measure in the doctor's office routinely, like blood pressure and body temperature, other metrics like that.
Yeah.
And it's because of this just very strong relationship between this is your fitness level and this is your risk of dying from all causes, so your overall mortality. And what it's showing is moving from a low to a moderate to a high fitness, that's associated with a marked reduction in mortality risk. Doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman. And the biggest change, the biggest benefit comes from just moving out of this low fitness level.
Yeah. And that's a common theme I find. You've seen that curvilinear type of response, and it, everybody wants to optimize, who doesn't want to be in the high end or whatever, but it's almost like just don't be in the lowest part of the curve, right?
Yeah, just don't be on the floor.
Do something. Yeah.
Exactly.
Amazing.
Right. And so they made this point. I think this only become stronger over the last decade, but it's potentially a stronger predictor of mortality than many other of the established risk factors, again, that we think about: smoking, cholesterol, high blood pressure.
Smoking is, that's an interesting one, right? Because I do point out to people, I'm like, if something can literally better smoking as a predictor, because it's not good, right? That's pretty powerful, right? So amazing.
So the other point they made in this review was that we should be measuring this routinely, right? So either a direct measurement, an estimate, but it should become part of standard clinical encounters that physicians and their patients are worrying about over time.
Yeah, and to be clear, I think for everybody, we test folks here who are in cardiac rehabilitation. We don't put them on a bike and take them to max. So we do something sub-maximally. And we estimate from there. So what can people then expect? I think the key thing people are talking about, longevity. I'm not sure they all mean longevity, but we can unpack that later. What can you expect in terms of, years of life added or something like that? Do you have those sort of data?
So again, like this general rule of thumb is a 1 MET higher cardiorespiratory fitness translates to about a 15% lower mortality risk. There's not a real clear number in terms of you boost your VO₂max by this much, you can expect this many more years of living. But suffice to say, you're increasing the chances of living longer, but probably more importantly, of a healthier life as well, right? This whole notion of health span.
So probably I think that's the metric people care about, right? It's not, people would like to live longer. Who doesn't, right? But you want to live well. And I think that's so chronic disease risk reduction is really this. So now I remember actually, I thought you had sort of cued me to this, is the Tour de France cyclists, they live longer, or I can't remember exactly.
They're basically data showing that I think it was 6 years longer the average Tour de France cyclist lived. Right now, that's a lot of time invested.
That's probably the extreme, but I think again, to translate that back to the moderate versus high, the difference might be small, but it's really going from the low to the moderate, or definitely from the zero end of things. No, that's great.
So how do we determine VO₂max or assess it? If you come into our laboratory, it would basically look like this, right? So this idea of a graded exercise test to exhaustion, typically on a bike, or it can be done on a treadmill. We're using something known as a metabolic cart to very carefully measure the oxygen uptake by the body there. And so this is really the gold standard, is a direct measure of oxygen uptake during some sort of incremental exercise test till exhaustion, until you really can't go anymore. So again, it's gold standard, but there's a cost involved. In our lab, it's about $150. Depends on the equipment, procedures, motivation, but generally, an accredited exercise physiology lab, these are going to be very solid numbers across the board. If the folks know what they're doing.
So if you don't have $150 or access to a lab, what can people do?
So next best, I would say, is an indirect measure. And this is commonly based on your heart rate response. So very often you do 2 submaximal exercise workloads. There's tests known as the YMCA fitness test, where that's you're stepping up and down on a bench. There's various cycling protocols. So several different protocols, we can drop them in the show notes, they've been scientifically validated. So you don't have to do an all-out exercise test. You don't have to have all this fancy equipment. You can really just measure your heart rate response to exercise. Or sometimes it's just how long you can go, the classic beep test or shuttle run. But importantly, these have been validated in scientific studies.
I'm going to throw out a name. We'll play the name game. Ulrik Wisløff. And, I know you've worked with Ulrik, amazing Norwegian scientist. What can you tell us about what he's contributed? Like the Hunt study, I remember at one point. So
Ulrik is an amazing scientist who's contributed immensely, especially in the area of high intensity interval training, among the first to really be applying HIIT in individuals with cardiovascular disease, really showing the benefits there. I hesitated because, HIIT has been applied over various decades to people with cardiovascular disease. German scientists were doing it back in the 80s and Canadian scientists even before that. But Ulrik was really conducting these randomized controlled trials, carefully calibrating dose of HIIT versus versus moderate. But the Hunt study that you alluded to, that just showed that a single weekly bout of high intensity exercise lowered all-cause mortality risk.
So that was a trial. That's not observation, right?
That was an intervention. So there, I guess that was actually epidemiological evidence.
Okay.
But subsequently, it's been shown that various bouts of HIIT, can improve VO₂max. But that was epidemiological evidence. Again, getting back to this idea, just a single weekly bout of vigorous or high intensity exercise lowers mortality risk, right? And, in Canada, the classic example is the beer league hockey player.
Hey, who wants to hurt their team more, boys? Keep it up and find out.
They do one bout of vigorous exercise a week. And sometimes, we see these tragic examples of someone will have a heart attack on an ice. And again, tragic. But if the question was going to be, is that good or bad for that individual in the big picture? The answer is clear. That single weekly bout of vigorous ice hockey overall is going to lower their risk of dying from all causes. It's going to be beneficial for them, even though when they're acutely doing the ice hockey event, it's transiently elevating their risk a little bit.
Their risk is up, yeah. So you've just made a lot of guys who I think are listening to, and women too, doing that one bout a week, because hockey by its nature, I mean, it is vigorous and, for most people, but relative to where your ceiling is. And so, that's an interesting observation.
Absolutely. But, you mentioned Ulrik. Ulrik's really one of the driving forces behind this. And that's, can I get a number without doing any exercise? And the answer is yes. You can find lots of online calculators, but I would direct our audience to this one. So Google World Fitness Level or go to that page. And there's a validated non-exercise algorithm. So it'll ask you some questions about your age, your resting heart rate, how active you are. You don't have to do any exercise, but it's going to give you an estimate of your fitness level. And it's going to put it relative to other people your age and sex. So, you can sort of see how do I stack up with this estimate? So it's convenient. It definitely provides a risk estimate. It's been validated in scientific studies, but it's the lowest individual accuracy.
Yeah, no, fair enough. So maybe we can give folks an idea, and I've done my VO₂max. I haven't done it for years, but I mean, what is a good number? And I'm sure, it depends on male, female, how old you are, lots of things, but what's a good number? I don't need world class. I just, what regular dude, what's a good number?
Yeah, so let's put that in context and let's go to the data. This is some of the best data that's available. These are published a couple of years ago, and it's based on data from over 16,000 individuals across a broad age range from 20 to almost 90 years of age. And you see the basic picture here. So what it's showing is age on the x-axis and fitness or VO2 peak on the y-axis. And so you can see a couple of things. There's clearly an age-related decline in VO₂max over time. And so, again, what this is showing is data for men and women. These would sort of be the average values. These are our confidence intervals, and then we have some outliers there. But again, you see this age-related change. But the average adult VO₂max is about 35 milliliters per kilogram per minute. So, what does that mean? Well, if you think of VO₂max on a scale from about 0 to 100, the average adult has a VO₂max of 35. Your resting oxygen requirement is 3.5.
Right.
So the oxygen uptake we need just to survive, you can imagine laying still in bed or on the couch, the amount of oxygen just to keep us alive is 3.5. So what does that mean? Well, it means the average individual has a VO₂max of about 10 mets. Right? Or there's a functional reserve capacity there of about 10.
Right.
So you can see where this is going. If you get your VO₂max higher, you have more reserve capacity.
Sure. Conversely,
if it's low, even getting to activities of daily living can be very, very challenging, right?
Yeah.
And so, in terms of factors that affect it, again, we see men on average, biological males tend to have a little bit higher values, and that's largely for biological reasons. They tend to have a little bit bigger hearts, a little bit more blood volume, but, huge variability between sexes. There's an age-related decline, largely owing to that reduction in heart rate. But you can see here that, we can have people in their 80s who are well above the adult average. World-class VO2 max values are up here. So typically in younger individuals, high-level endurance athletes, we see values in the 70s, 80s. The highest ever reported in the scientific literature is around 91. Conversely, we can see young people with very low VO2 max values, under 20.
So you talk about reserve, and going up a flight of stairs sits where on?
Yeah, so the number that I'll often remind people of is your minimum functional VO2. So this is basically the oxygen requirement that you need for activities of daily living,
right?
Walking around, taking the odd flight of stairs, carrying the groceries, playing with your children.
Right.
That's about 4 METs.
Right.
And so you can see that, especially if you're starting out with a low capacity, or as we age, more people get down to this sort of functional floor. Staying above that is absolutely critical, right? And so you can sort of think of VO2 max, it's like insurance in the bank. You want to drive that higher and higher if you can. But hopefully that gives folks a sense of, typical numbers, where the average person stands. And maybe the last point is just how much should it change to be beneficial, right? So last point is, we showed some data that obviously a higher VO2 max is associated with lower risk of dying. This is a really interesting study. Again, large scale study, over 90,000 people. What they did here is they actually measured a change in values. So these people all had 2 direct measures of cardiorespiratory fitness at least a year apart. And then they said, okay, depending how that value changed, did they get healthier or not, and by how much? And so a couple of interesting points here. This is showing the group in that least fit quartile. So this is 25% of the people who are the least fit. If they boosted their VO2 max by about 1 MET or so, that's that value that we keep coming back to, they had an overall reduction in mortality risk. If they increased their VO2 max more, they got more of a reduction. Conversely, if their VO2 max went down, they had a higher risk of dying, sort of in a dose-dependent manner there. So this is that fundamental relationship. And the really interesting thing was this study was, it didn't matter where you started out on the fitness scale. So this is the next quartile, what they called the low fit individuals. These are the moderately fit individuals. And these were the high fit individuals. So you can see that basic pattern is the same here.
So it didn't actually matter where you started.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's some powerful data.
Even if you're relatively fit to begin with, boosting your VO2 max further, it's still going to provide greater health benefits to you. And so again, their takeaway from this, and I think this is a consistent message, encouraging the public to improve their fitness by about 1 MET. It's about 10% for the average person. Can have huge public health significance, but more importantly for the individual personal health significance.
And just to give people some perspective as well, I mean, the axis here sort of, they go, what is HR? I mean, that's a hazard ratio. That's essentially it's your risk of dying. And so that's a hard endpoint, right? It's not like, oh, well, your blood pressure went down. It's like, it's literally tombstone. So, I think that some of the numbers you put up there, and again, just my perspective is those numbers are astonishing reductions when you look at those a year apart, which is, I can't even think of something that is that powerful, like not cholesterol, not blood pressure, et cetera. Like, so to the 5th vital sign part, I mean, this is our friend Bob Ross. It really puts a striking exclamation point on the power of this measure.
100%, and you don't have to, these measurements were a year apart, but for the average person, they can get that 10% boost with a couple of months, surely, of exercise training. And for some people in 6 or 8 weeks with many different types of exercise
if the
training.
Hunt study is translatable, that's the one high intensity bout a week. So don't give up your Friday night or your Thursday night or Sunday night, whatever, hockey. That's a good one.
Do something you like and enjoy, stick with it over time.
What about improving your VO2 max? So this has sort of been held up, I think, if you go to social media, as like, it literally is, it's the holy grail of, if you like, endurance or aerobic exercise. So how do you improve it? What can you sort of expect? Does everybody get the same? And what about how do these folks who are out there, the top, the creme de la creme of folk. Like, are they born with that, or they train that? Can I become I'm certainly not my age, but could I become a Tour de France cyclist if I'm just out for a weekend ride?
Yeah, I often explain VO₂max it's a bit like mortgages for a lot of people. So there's a fixed component and there's a variable element. And so what I mean by that is the fixed component is there's no doubt there's a biological or underlying genetic basis for this. And so as you know, if you're not born with the genetic capacity to have a very large heart that pumps a lot of blood, you're never going to be an elite endurance athlete. So you can train as much as you want. So VO₂max, it's clearly related to some things like biological sex, your age, your genetic capacity, but there's a massive trainability component to it. So for the average person, they can probably improve their VO₂max in total by about 20 or 25% through exercise training, right? And they can get a lot of that early on.
That's not small.
No, it's not.
That's actually more than I thought you were going to say.
But there's huge variability there. So some people, they can, I'm thinking there, the classic heritage studies where they took, hundreds of people and put them through a very structured exercise program that lasted 6 months. Some of the people, their VO₂max didn't change at all. Obviously very frustrating. This is 6 months of supervised exercise training, about 4 or 5 hours a week, and their number didn't budge. And others can improve it by 100%.
Right.
So there's massive individual variability there. The difficult thing is we can't look at each other and measure anything to know how much it's going to improve by.
Yeah. And is it people that start out low get the biggest, improvement, or is it people, or do we know that?
No, I think that variability is across the board. But if you're going to be an elite endurance athlete, it's obviously a combination of a high volume of exercise training, a significant amount of that at high intensity. But you just have to be born with that genetic predisposition to develop a big VO₂max, a big engine.
Yeah. So, and I know, if we walk down to your lab, there's a board up there where everybody's written down, and I won't say who's got the peak or whatever, but what kind of ranges are we talking about?
Yeah. So again, I'll often say, VO₂max, it's basically on a scale from 0 to 100. The highest value that I believe that's ever been reported in the scientific literature is a 91 in a very elite cross-country skier. So, high-level elite endurance athletes, they're in the mid to high 70s, 80s, even up into the 90s. That's sort of the peak that we're talking about. Those elite athletes, almost 3 times the average. And, we deal with a lot of young, active students around here. And so we'll routinely see numbers of 40, 50. The highest VO₂max that we've tested in our lab was 84. A young male triathlete. So pretty impressive. That's you're getting up into world-class values. It absolutely is. And again, as you know, that's one component of being a world-class athlete. Just because you have a high VO₂max, it's not a recipe for success. You need to work close to the ceiling for a long period of time. And that's things like your lactate threshold and that.
It's interesting to have this discussion online because I've seen it bandied back and forth, and I just sit on the sidelines sort of like, what's the highest that ever got recorded? And to your point, I think, people say high 90s, but there has been, people throw out things over 100 and possible, or,
you're
maybe, calling,
right?
Oh, I don't know about that.
Maybe, this was in a review by Carsten Lundby, who's a very respected integrative exercise physiologist. And so if Carsten says, in his estimation, it's 91 and change, that's the highest value they've seen, that's good enough for me.
No, fair enough. So for sort of regular folks kind of seeking better health, and this has taken on almost its sort of lore in terms of improving your health, what should we be doing? Let's just lay it out for everybody. So not zone 2, like is that the foundational where, we're not going to go there?
As we talked about, zone 2, depending on who you are, could be way too low, could be right in the middle, or it could be very vigorous exercise. So, that's why we prefer not to utilize that term. Suffice to say, there's lots of different types and combinations of moderate to vigorous exercise that can improve your VO2 max, right? So you could do traditional moderate intensity cardio, couple sessions a week for 45 minutes or so, and you're likely to improve your VO2 max.
Yeah.
You can also do it through high intensity interval training for a given amount of time or a given dose of exercise. I think the data is clear that vigorous is better. So the higher you're willing and able to work for unit of time invested, that's going to be better to enhance your VO2 max. So there's definitely a time efficiency to interval training or vigorous exercise. And that's across the board, right? This is healthy individuals. These are people who have cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, many different conditions. Almost across the board, the systematic reviews and meta-analyses are clear that more vigorous, often interval-based exercise is better to elicit improvements in VO2 max. But again, to be clear, if you really dislike HIIT, you don't have to do HIIT to boost your VO2 max.
Right. So it's interesting, and maybe I'll draw an analogy here to bring it back to what's really important, which is strength, of course, is that you get better at what you practice doing, right? So if you want to lift heavy things, then lift heavy things. So if you want to improve your ceiling, you have to work close to your ceiling. Yeah? Is that?
Yes. And I would say there's some analogies there with lifting in terms of, as you've shown, lifting lighter or moderate weights. You just have to do more of it.
Yeah.
You're going to get strong, right? And so I think there's analogies to aerobic exercise. You can do moderate intensity, but you probably got to do more of it to get the same improvement as you would with the more vigorous, shorter stuff, right? How quickly can VO2 max improve? There's a classic study known as the Hickson study from the 70s. I think it was 8 young men who were subjected to a very intensive program, 6 days a week. They did 3 days a week of continuous exercise for 40 minutes at the highest sustainable pace.
Were they Scandinavian? I just need to know.
No, they were not actually Scandinavian. But 3 days a week of hard, continuous work, 3 days a week of intervals, and the average improvement in VO2 max was 44% over 10 weeks.
Wow.
So clearly you can get, and some improved by a lot more than that.
Yeah.
So clearly a high volume of very vigorous work can remarkably improve VO2 max. Now, most people aren't suited for that, right?
Yeah, that's tough.
And so again, the average person can expect probably about a 10 to 15% improvement with 6 to 12 weeks of training. And at most, they can improve their VO2 max by 20-25%.
Okay, so we asked the EverMe intelligence model how to improve your VO2 max. And so we pressure tested here, and it came up with this. So we've got engage in high intensity interval training, moderate intensity continuous training, it said 45 minutes at about 70% of your heart rate. Consistency is key, and monitor your progress.
Yeah, pretty good, right? High level takeaways. I think that what that's saying is lots of different exercise can be good. Right. Moderate's fine. HIIT is better in terms of the time efficiency aspect, but you can do either. Consistency is key if you want to keep your VO2 max up. And as we've highlighted, monitor your progress. So get a marker in the ground, even if it's not entirely accurate, you estimated it, just use that and track changes over time. So is your training program providing benefits to you or not?
Yeah, and I think that feedback part, a lot of people, that's what they're looking for. Is what I'm doing working, right? So yeah, and consistency, underline, brilliant. So our listener question this week comes from Mark. He's an investment professional obsessed with optimization. Who isn't, right? And what he wants to know, he says, what is the fastest way to improve VO2 max, VO2 peak, and in the shortest amount of time?
Yeah, I think the answer would be repeated 3 to 5 minute hard effort. So that's at the highest sustainable pace. So lots of different ways to boost your VO2 max, but if you had to pick one way of doing it, repeated 3 to 5 minute, very hard efforts, repeat that 4, 5, 6 times, do that a couple of times a week.
That sounds grueling, but I guess if you're going for optimization, that's the price you pay.
Thanks for tuning in this week.
Exercise Science is sponsored by EverMe and is produced by Ghost Bureau out of Toronto.
Remember, we're on most platforms at Real Exercise Science. Give us a follow or a subscribe. And if you enjoyed this episode, please by all means share this podcast with someone in your life who wants to know more about exercise science.
We'll see you next week.
The Exercise Science Podcast is for educational and entertainment purposes only and is not a substitute for professional medical advice. Strength training and fitness carry inherent risks. Always consult with a physician before starting any new exercise program or making changes to your diet. The hosts, producers, sponsors, and guests of this podcast disclaim any liability for any injuries or losses connected with the information discussed in this show. The science of strength and fitness is continually evolving. While we strive to provide accurate, evidence-based information, we make no representations or warranties regarding the completeness, accuracy, or timeliness of the information discussed.